right, it is 8:05 a.m. Pacific time, and we are ready to start the webinar. Thank you very much for everyone that has joined me this morning, or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Thanks all the same. My name is Jennifer Lindsay. I am an InfoPath developer, and lately I've been specializing in mobile form development, customizing InfoPath forms for use on mobile devices, tablets, phones, what have you. And today's webinar is going to be about tips and tricks for deploying InfoPath templates as Formotus mobile forms. Before it gets started, I would like to first go through two polls just to gauge the background of everyone here and your relative interest in mobile form development. So the first poll, I'd like to know whether or not your organization has a need for mobile forms. So I've just launched that first poll, and go ahead and enter your answers, and I'll wait a few seconds. While you're voting, the original topic of this webinar was supposed to be mobile forms in general, but we ended up deciding to narrow down the focus and specialize in Formotus, and that was for a couple of reasons. First of all, Formotus is one of the major players in the mobile form development field, and we'll go into a little bit more about their features later on in the webinar and why that is so. And secondly, we've had a lot of requests lately from consulting customers to help them develop more complex mobile forms using the Formotus platform for various reasons. Again, we'll talk a little bit about more of those, depending mainly on the features that Formotus offers that a lot of other form development platforms don't offer, including InfoPath. There are some key features of Formotus that are not natively supported in InfoPath. All right, it looks like we have almost everyone has voted at this point. It looks like over half of you said yes, you do have a need for mobile forms. Well, that's great. So this webinar will probably be very useful for you. The other half of you, about 30%, are not sure, and 20% of you said no. Well, that's fine. Maybe hopefully we'll convert you over to the yes side, or at least the not sure side, once we give you an idea of what mobile forms can do for you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll. And our second one is, are you interested in Formotus? And if so, why? So I went ahead and launched that second poll. Go ahead and let us know whether or not you're interested specifically in Formotus for your mobile form needs. I see some of you are interested in free coffee and donuts. Well, I can tell you that we tried. However, my router had a very hard time figuring out where the free coffee and donuts were supposed to go. So unfortunately, all you get is this fancy schmancy presentation and demos. So sorry about that, those of you who wanted free coffee and donuts. All right, so it looks like about half of you are not sure whether or not you're interested in Formotus, which is fine. I'm guessing some of you are probably quite new to this Formotus platform, and that's okay. You'll get to see a little bit of that in action. All right. Well, thank you very much for answering those two polls, and let's go ahead and launch into the webinar itself. All right, so first of all, for those of you who are not familiar with Formotus, here is a quick overview. The primary goal of Formotus is to deploy electronic forms on mobile devices. Now, the mobile device environment has a couple of different features and also different features and abilities than just filling out forms on your desktop computer. For one, since your device is mobile, you can go into areas where there is no wireless connection and fill out forms offline. That's something that you can't do with InfoPath. InfoPath requires you to be online when you are submitting forms. And this even includes submitting forms via email. Formotus will cache the forms locally on your device, and as soon as you have a wireless connection, it will go ahead and submit or email the forms however you've configured. There are several Formotus-specific controls that are not available in InfoPath or on the desktop. These are the camera control. You can harness the camera on your device and take pictures and add them directly into the form. There's a GPS control where you can embed a small map. There's a signature control where you can actually, use your finger or a stylus and sign your name directly onto the form. There's also a barcode control. These are added into InfoPath as XTPs. The Formotus app runs natively on Android, Apple, iOS devices, and Windows devices. That's another plus. You're able to submit data via email, as I've mentioned before. You can also submit to SharePoint, just like you've probably done with InfoPath before. And you can also submit to a cloud storage like Google Drive or Box or Dropbox. You have that ability as well. As far as creating forms, Formotus also has their own form creator. They're calling it Formotus Creator. You can create templates from scratch there, or you can deploy templates that are created in InfoPath, and that's probably going to be the choice for most of you, especially if you're already familiar with the InfoPath Designer interface. It'll just be faster and easier for you to do that. However, not everything that works in InfoPath works in Formotus, and that's going to be the subject of today's webinar. We're going to go through some tips and tricks that can allow you to take some of the features and some of the design logic that you may have used in your InfoPath forms already, or that you may find helpful for InfoPath development, and show how to modify that logic and that design technique to make those same features work in Formotus. So we're going to be talking about how to run rules that involve fields that aren't displayed, how to run rules that will hide and show fields or sections, workarounds for binding multiple controls to a single field. These are all things that you're able to do in InfoPath, but don't necessarily work in Formotus without a few tweaks. Workarounds for reference fields and attachment fields, which are not supported by Formotus. Configuring people picker controls, there's a little bit of a trick in there, something that's not required in InfoPath but is required in Formotus. And also some limitations of using Formotus controls, those Formotus specific controls I mentioned on the previous slide. There are some limitations to using those on Windows devices. And also we'll talk a little bit about the Formotus ribbon, which is a bit of a hidden feature. It's not explicitly mentioned in the Formotus documentation, and so I'll give you a little bit of a heads up on that. All right, so as far as these hidden logic fields, or the logic fields that you need to display on the form in order to get things working in Formotus. So obviously, if you're designing a form, you don't always want to display every schema field on the form, right? Like, for example, if you have some of your users are administrators, so you may add a schema field called isAdmin, and if the person is an admin, that gets set to yes, and depending on that, you may display extra fields in the form or extra sections that only the administrator should see. So it turns out Formotus will only execute rules if all of the fields that are involved in the rules are displayed on the form. So if you have any intermediate values, maybe you have some complicated calculations and you're storing intermediate values in some of your schema fields, or background values like that isAdmin flag that the user doesn't need to interact with, they actually must appear on the current view of the form, or else the rule will not execute properly all the time. But obviously you don't want the user to be able to modify these. You don't want your user to be able to type yes or true into that isAdmin field and magically become an administrator. So the solution to this is to add a special area, usually at the bottom of your form is the best place to hide this, and this area is just going to show up as blank white space to the user, and I call this the form logic area. And what you want to do is add these intermediate or background fields like the isAdmin flag, add them as either calculated value controls or read-only text boxes. So they are on the field, sorry, they are on the form, but the user can't see them or interact with them. Make the text color match the form background so it's completely invisible, because obviously if you're changing the value of the field, those values will show up. And you can even shrink the field to 1 point by 1 point, or 1 pixel by 1 pixel, so that it's very, very tiny. If you have like dozens of these, you're building a very complicated form. You don't want there to be a huge amount of white space at the bottom for all those fields, so you can shrink them down if you want to. And the result is that these fields are completely invisible to the user, but they are on the form, and therefore Formotus will actually execute rules involving those fields. So let me give you a quick demo. Not a demo, let me just show you what one of these logic section looks like on a form that I've built before. So what I usually do is I throw in a calculated value field just to remind myself that everything below here is for the purposes of making my rules work correctly in Formotus. I have a formatting rule on this to simply make sure that it's always hidden, so when my users are using the form they won't see this, but in design mode I see it and it reminds me. And down here I have actually many of these form logic fields, and you'll see I think I've made these mostly text boxes, and under the properties I've just made sure, oops, this one is supposed to be read-only. That should be read-only. I've made sure to make them read-only. And you can see I even have repeating sections down here. I have some form logic fields and repeating sections. Those are read-only, and I've put as many down here as I need, and I've even set the text color. Well, you can't see it here, but I made sure to set the text color to white. There we go. Yeah, the text color was always already set to white. So that's in general how I design these things, and you can see it's at the very bottom underneath the submit button. So the user will not see any of this, and all my Formotus logic will execute correctly. Okay, that was my demo. So now let's talk a little bit about hide show logic. So a lot of times on your forms you may want to use formatting rules to show certain parts of the form at some times, and then depending on user input you may want to hide certain parts. Like for example in an expense report, if the dollar amount is greater than a certain amount, say maybe greater than $50 or greater than $75, you want the user to include a receipt. So you would then show a special section with a picture control where they could attach that receipt. So this is pretty common, hiding and showing fields depending on user input. However, in Formotus, hide show rules like this, where you're hiding and showing things depending on user input, they don't always execute correctly if you put the rules directly on the control. So that's directly on the fields, especially calculated values. So if it's not working, first see if the rule involves a hidden field. Like we mentioned on the previous section, if it involves a behind-the-scenes background field. If it does, then definitely make sure that hidden field is on the form in that form logic section I just showed you. If it's still not working, the hide show rules, then try dragging that control into its own section and apply your hide show rule logic directly to the section instead of directly to the field. So let me give you a quick demo of that. And for this, I'm actually going to use an Android emulator that I have right here on my PC. This is called BlueStacks. It's a free download. And this actually allows you to access the Google Play Store. And you can download a working version of the Formotus Pro and also the other Formotus software that we won't be talking about here, Formotus Now. You can download both of those apps to the Play Store, install them on the emulator, and it works just like if you had your own Android device. So let me go ahead and find my hide show demo. There it is. This is a list of all the forms that I have installed on this device right now. So I'm going to click the hide show, and this is going to open a blank form template. So here, this is an example form for a form I designed for a customer earlier this year. And if I click this reinspection checkbox, it pops up with a label, and I have two labels here because I've done them two different ways, and a text box for me to type in a previous inspection number. Now, I had a lot of trouble getting this label to hide if I unchecked that box. You'll see this one that has calc value in it. This is a calculated value field. That's just a label. It would not hide when I unchecked that box. What I had to do is take that label and encapsulate it in its own small section. And then once I did that, I got the hide show logic to work correctly. So let me quickly switch to the hide show. Excuse me for a second, I don't actually have it open. Let me open up the hide show template so you can see what that looks like in design mode. Here it is. So you'll see this is the calculated value that refused to hide when I threw on the my normal hide show logic. That worked fine in InfoPath, but it wouldn't work in Formotus. What I had to do is just take that text and throw it in its own special section, and then I applied the same hide show logic to the section, and then it would hide and show as it was supposed to. So there we go. That's a tip for getting fields to hide show correctly in Formotus. All right, so let's talk a little bit about binding multiple controls to a single field. Now this doesn't happen all the time, but for example, Formotus does not support the combo box control, and this is a special type of InfoPath control where you can either have it function as a drop-down list with choices, or you could type directly into it and use it just like a text box. It's basically a drop-down list and a text box combined. Well, Formotus doesn't support this, so I did what I normally do in InfoPath, and I switched to using a drop-down and a text box bound to the same schema field. And then I applied logic to these fields so that if the user selected other from the drop-down, it would instead switch to displaying the text box for manual entry. And I had a button that would allow you to switch back to the drop-down so they could toggle back and forth between those. So it functioned essentially as a combo box control. Well, Formotus did not support this workaround either, and it turns out Formotus does not support multiple controls bound to a single field. So there went that workaround. So it turns out there is a different workaround that you can use, and this actually involves creating multiple schema fields. So what I did is I had 3 fields now instead of 1 for this particular field. I have 3 schema fields in the background. You bind one to the drop-down, bind the other to the text box, and the third one is going to be the one that stores the final value, no matter whether the user uses a drop-down or text box to enter that value. So what I have is logic to copy the values that the user enters through the drop-down or the text box into the final original field that I want to store the actual value. And then you simply apply hide show logic to the drop-down in the text box, again using the sections trick we showed on the previous slide if you can't get the hide show logic to work directly on the fields. So let me pop up a quick demo of that, and this just shows it working correctly. So let me let me quickly show you what it can look like when it malfunctions. So you'll notice first of all there's a drop down and a text box that are both displayed. This is if I try to use the binding both the drop down and the text box to the same field. I couldn't get it to show one or the other. It would always start out showing both, which is not what I wanted to. Although if I do select other, it hides the drop down and shows the text box. So that was basically what it will look like in Formotus if you try to bind multiple controls to a single field. You won't get the controls to display how you want it to. And here's a quick demo showing the workaround. This is the final form that I built for the customer. I first have to select a region, and then, oops, wrong region, that one doesn't have an other option. And then if I select other from that bottom drop down, it switches to a text box. And then I can now enter the values that I need as the text box. So that's what I was talking about, using multiple controls for a single field. And behind the scenes, that value would get saved to that third field behind the scenes, no matter whether it was entered using a drop down or a text box. Okay. And let's talk a little bit about people pickers. So I'm sure you guys have probably all used the people picker control. It's very useful for filling out information or adding people to the form who are already have access to your SharePoint system or are already in your SharePoint system. In InfoPath, the People Picker control automatically knows to display users from the same site that you've published your InfoPath form to. That's just an automatic thing that goes on behind the scenes. In Formotus, however, you need to manually specify this site in the control properties, even if your form is also published to a SharePoint site. So here's a quick screenshot to show you where you find that. If you right-click on the People Picker control, you bring up the Properties menu. On the SharePoint Server tab, there will be a link where you can enter the server address, and you want to enter the same site that your form is published to. Oops. And let me give you a quick demo of what happens so you know what errors you can expect to see. So this top one, this is how the People Picker looks on a Android device. So if you click the little address book icon, it brings up this, and I can add whoever I want, and then if I click the back button, it will add that person in. So that's a People Picker that has been manually connected to the SharePoint site using the Properties menu I just showed you. If you don't do that, it will prompt you for credentials, oops. Let me enter these again. And you will get this, an unknown submit error occurred. And so just off the basis of this error, you wouldn't necessarily know that you would need to specify the SharePoint site in the Properties menu of the People Picker. But if you do get this on a People Picker, that's the first thing you should check. Make sure that you've actually specified that site in the control properties. All right. Next up, reference fields and attachment fields. So just a quick refresher for those of you who may not use these, reference fields are fields in the schema that have the exact same name and the exact same properties. So for example, if you have a section where you need to take down someone's name and their address and their phone number, like a hospital information sheet, you want the name, address, phone number of the patient, and then also the name, address, phone number of the primary insured person. So since you want the same logic applied to both of those collections of fields, sometimes you'll just make them reference fields in the background, so you don't have to copy over all of the properties, a second time. Attachment fields, which you've probably used more often, these are used primarily to attach non-image documents. You can also attach image documents if you want as well, but a lot of people use these for Word documents or PDF or Excel files, etc. So reference fields are actually not supported. You can publish an InfoPath template to Formotus that contains reference fields. It will not throw any errors if you have a reference field in there, or not always. So it can sort of slip by the Formotus converter engine, but it can cause errors in rule execution, and I'll show you an error that I ran into that stumped me for a couple of days last fall when I was designing a form of reference fields. The solution is just to not use them. If you have two fields that are basically containing the same information, just use similar names. There are many ways you can spell part number so that the name of the field captures the intent of that control. And if you want them to have the exact same behavior, just copy and paste rules over using the built-in InfoPath copy and paste buttons for copying and pasting rules. Attachment fields are not supported, although I must say that I have been able to publish InfoPath templates to Formotus, or deploy them to Formotus rather, upload and deploy them to Formotus. I have been able to deploy forms that contain attachment fields in it. However, they will never be displayed on the form. So even if you do get a form with an attachment field past the Formotus converter engine, it will not be displayed. So if you mean to attach pictures, certainly use the Formotus camera or annotation controls. Those are Formotus specific controls that are can also handle attaching pictures on your device. You don't necessarily have to use them to take a photo with the device's camera. You can just access your photo library instead and upload photos that are already on your, or pictures that are already on your device. If you do manage to get an attachment field into the form and have it upload successfully to Formotus, if you're submitting the form to SharePoint, you can always go into SharePoint later on, reopen the form, and the attachment control will appear if you're opening it in InfoPath later on after you submitted the form from Formotus. And then obviously you could just use the attachment field in InfoPath and attach it there. So I wanted to do a quick demo because this was a wacky, wild error that I ran into for the this reference field. I believe this is the correct demo. Oops. No, oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'm looking in the wrong place. They are down here. So here is what happened when I had the reference field. And I'll scroll down to the field, oops, the field that I actually need. So you'll notice that there is a, oops. Uh-oh, okay, I've lost my form. There we go. Ah, right, there is some data that loads in this form. This was an older draft of it, so the data loaded somewhat slowly. So there we go. So you'll notice that there is a part number field up here in the top, and just past the scroll down here, there's another part number field. I originally made these reference fields. So keep your eye on the data in this as received condition section. Once I entered a value into the part number field, all this data disappeared, and I could not figure out for the life of me why that happened. So notice this affected data that had nothing to do with the part number fields. And that has to do with the way that the reference fields were interfering with Formotus behind the scenes. So once I got rid of the reference field, I just removed the reference field from the second section, and I just made it a normal field and named it similarly and copied over the same rules. Then that data no longer disappeared when I entered a value in the part number field. So if you're using reference fields and you're getting weird errors in Formotus, keep in mind that might be the problem. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about is using Formotus controls on Windows devices. Now this only applies to the Formotus controls that involve images. That's a bit of a misnomer. The primary ones are the annotation controls and the ink controls, but really any Formotus specific control, any Formotus control, including just the native picture control from InfoPath, on a Windows device. So if the XPath in your schema to the actual fields that contain the image, those are usually named IMG or signature in the Formotus specific controls. If that's too long, then when you deploy your form on Formotus and you go to fill it out and you go to submit the form, you will get an error that looks like this. So the reason for this is that anything that makes the file path behind the scenes on your device, so in the device's operating system, what happens is Formotus actually saves those images temporarily in the draft. It saves them to your device. And if the file path to those images on the device are more than 256 characters long, and that's a built-in Windows limitation, there's no way around it, then it's unable to actually save those images, and you will get this error when you try to submit the form. So what you can do is avoid long field and group names. So for example, you know, if you have, a lot of times it's really nice to spell out the entire name of the group so that if you go and pick up the form template, say, you know, 3 or 4 months down the road, you don't really have to guess, you know, what all these acronyms mean anymore. However, in this case, we do suggest that you take any long group names and just abbreviate them or use acronyms just to make the XPath shorter. Another suggestion is to avoid formulas that create long form names. So sometimes you like to concatenate multiple fields to make a unique form name. Maybe you have the name of the user and the name of their department, and then the date time or something like that and the form name, that can also create this error as well. And another suggestion is just to take these controls and place them directly under the root schema. Don't nest them very, very far deep down into the schema. And that will also help to reduce the length of this file path behind the scenes. Okay, and the very last one is what I'm calling the Formotus ribbon. So Formotus actually has an equivalent to the InfoPath ribbon if you have a form open. Now you may or may not recall what the InfoPath ribbon is. It is, let me see if I've got one in here. I have to make sure that it's configured. This is a ribbon that appears at the top of the form, and I don't, so let me quickly throw a whole bunch of stuff in it. This is a ribbon that appears at the top of the form. You access it in Form Options in the File menu in InfoPath Designer, and depending on whether you're using a web browser or an InfoPath filler form, here we go. In the web browser, this particular menu will allow you to select special commands and buttons that will appear at the top of the form when it's being used. So in InfoPath, and I have it hidden right now, I believe. There we go. Yes, I had it hidden in InfoPath. So in InfoPath, you'll see, for example, here is the Views menu. That was an option that I had there. And there's also, there are submit buttons that don't appear in InfoPath Preview, but there are additional buttons, Save and Submit buttons, that appear in that ribbon when it is published to a web browser. So in Formotus, these menus show up in slightly different ways on different devices. So if you're using an iOS device, an iPhone or an iPad, you'll access this menu using a special button in the upper right-hand corner. And one thing to note is that there is no save option. So even if you select the save option in Form Options, even if you click the Save and Save As checkboxes, it will not show up when you access the menu on your iOS device. And that's just a built-in limitation of the iOS operating system. On Android, you should use the menu button, and the location of the menu button varies wildly by device. On some devices, this is actually a hard-coded button, a physical button rather, at the bottom of your device and usually next to the home or the back button. Sometimes this is a software button. It'll show up as 3 vertical dots in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. There are other devices where it looks completely different, and so you know, it'd be best to look up the instruction manual for your specific device. It's usually called the menu button or the context button, and that would be the button you want to use. In Windows, you can either swipe from down to up on your Surface device, or you can press the menu key. This is what the menu key usually looks like if you're on a keyboard device or if you have a keyboard attached to your device, or you can click the right button of your mouse. Formotus also makes a desktop app for Windows, and so if you're sitting on your Windows laptop, you can always just use the physical menu button on your physical keyboard. And as I've been showing you, you can add and remove options that appear on that at the File Form Options in InfoPath. And like I said, the different options that are available vary by operating system and device. So let me quickly show you. Let me open up a, let's see, one of these forms. And with the menu button, I believe I should get a number of options. I did open up the form that, there we go. So you'll see down at the bottom, I have, so I just hit the menu button key on my laptop because I'm not using a tablet device. You'll see I hit that menu key, and down at the bottom there's a submit option, there is a new option, and there is a save option. I'm on an Android emulator, so save is available. If I were on an iOS device, save would not appear there. Keep in mind that these are tied to the options in InfoPath Designer in that Form Options menu on the web browser tab. So if you have all this fancy logic in your form and you want the user to have to fill out certain required fields, fill out certain sections in certain orders, or you want to do any fancy routing with your form, if you have Submit enabled in this menu, they can bypass all of that logic and go ahead and submit the form completely blank. So you want to make sure that you go into the ribbon, and this is a completely different form template, but it was just the one that I have. You want to go in here and make sure that you take off that Submit is not configured in this form, but if it were, I would want to make sure that that Submit checkbox was unchecked so that my users could not then just access this menu, maybe by accident, see the Submit button and say, oh, I can go ahead and submit the form now. So, also, you have the ability to save multiple drafts, keep multiple drafts saved on your device. So if I were halfway through filling out this form and I said, I don't have enough information to complete it, let me go fill out a new form for this other thing that I need to audit. I could bring up the menu button, click New, it would automatically save the draft of the current form that I'm looking at and open up a new one. So that's how you would do that. All right, so we've reached the end of the webinar. And if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and ask questions now in the Questions tab, and I will attempt to answer them. Let's see, any questions at all? All right. It looks like there are no questions. That either means that you understood absolutely everything that I was doing, or you already knew it already, perhaps. If there's interest, we can do further webinars on exploring in depth more some of the complicated techniques that you can use to build extremely complicated forms in Formotus. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the webinar. I have a couple of links in here that will give you a better idea of the InfoPath controls that are supported by Formotus, so you know exactly which controls are supported and which aren't. And also there's a link that will explain more about the custom Formotus controls, like the camera control, the GPS, the signature, and the barcode that I mentioned at the very beginning. And next week's webinar will be about how to build a form that looks good on handheld devices in InfoPath. So you don't necessarily need to use Formotus to build a form that works on a mobile device. Formotus does have some nice features like that offline capability that I mentioned and those additional controls. But if you just want to use what's available natively in InfoPath, you can still build a form that works on a mobile device. And next week's webinar will go into that a little more. All right, well, thank you very much for joining me this morning. If you, once you sign off at the end of this webinar, you'll be asked to fill out a survey. If you fill out the survey, you'll receive all the materials that have been presented during the webinar.